So all last year, all I ever heard about was the new adaptation of David Copperfield by Armando Iannucci. And it starred basically all my favorite British actors. You know, you had Peter Capaldi, whom you know from the Doctor Who series. It had Hugh Laurie, like a total legend. And of course, Tilda Swinton, whom you know from a million Tilda Swinton-y things. For those of you who haven't seen it, I really recommend Snowpiercer. Not the propaganda stuff that's out right now, but the actual movie that came out a few years ago. It's great. And of course, Dev Patel as David Copperfield. If you had told me Dev Patel as David Copperfield without my having seen the trailer, I would have been like, really? Is it because he was in Slumdog Millionaire? But then you see him in the trailer and then in the movie, which I have seen. He is so good in this role. I highly recommend this particular adaptation. It's funny, as you would imagine, because it has Iannucci behind it. But it has this energy and this verve to it that I don't think you necessarily find in a lot of Dickensian adaptations. But having watched the movie, I knew that I had to do a video about the book itself, which is one of the most interesting books in all English literature. Now, it's a little bit difficult to talk about Charles Dickens as an Indian because he was incredibly racist when it came to Indians. I think he was personally offended by the First War of Indian Independence, which the British know as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, and he basically advocated genocide at the time. It's amazing how many influential British people just wanted genocide. But despite that, Dickens is basically one of the great names in British literature and in English literature by default. I mean, just go through the man's book list. It's incredible. The Pickwick Papers, Hard Times, Little Dorrit, Great Expectation, A Tale of Two Cities, Nicholas Nickleby, David Copperfield. The man is English literature. So obviously when you're in India and you're being recommended things to read as part of English literature, you get to read a lot of Charles Dickens. And it's a pretty uncritical reading. I don't think anybody in my childhood ever stopped and said, you do know that he was a bit more complicated than these books suggest, right? And you might wonder, well, why can't you just let things be? Why does everything have to be political? And you would be wrong, because reading is a political act. I'm not even talking about something, like centuries ago or like Hitler burnt books. No. Look around you, even today, who gets to read what? Written by whom? These are incredibly political things, and there are governments, liberal democracies, that are trying their best to punish people or to limit what people can read. Books are ideas, books are ideologies. So yes, reading is a political act, and if you're on BookTube and if you're saying that you love to read, then that is something that you should always keep in mind. Coming off my soapbox, David Copperfield was basically Dickens's favorite book. A lot of it is autobiographical. He saw financial ruin. He considered his childhood not to be particularly pleasant. He wasn't an orphan, but he felt neglected by his mother, which is why you see a lot of antipathy towards his women characters. But at its heart, Copperfield is about a young man with very few connections who manages to use his talent to climb socially to a position of fame and fortune. And that was basically Dickens's own life. I was talking a little while ago about how Dickens is English literature, but the reason why he is so popular is also because he tried his best to democratize reading. In the 19th century, and I've talked about this before in my Sebastian Sincere episode, you should click the card above for a refresher. But the 19th century was pretty damn bad. Like, if it was terrible in the Regency era, then it was doubly worse during the Victorian era. And books were expensive, and not everybody knew how to read. So Dickens very cleverly serialized his books. So every month he would publish a new chapter, and people would pay to buy that particular edition. And so instead of them paying for a book, and a certain amount, they would just contribute a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And you would think that this would all come together in like a mess, like where would be the cohesion? But no, like Dickens knew what he was writing, even though he figured out that this was also an excellent way to remain in the good graces of his readers, because if they didn't react very well to a certain plot point or a certain character, they would write to him and they would complain. And so he would just reconfigure his characters or his plot. This obviously drew a lot of mockery by his fellow authors, but Dickens didn't care. He was selling like 40,000 copies in Victorian England of like a single chapter of his book. Money, money, money. Dickens has become so popular, in fact, that it doesn't matter if you've never read a single Dickens novel in your life. There are tropes, there are stereotypes, there are phrases that have just become part of the English language. Kind of like Shakespeare. The man's influence is enormous. So even if I have sort of conflicted feelings about reading a person who just entirely hated my race, and don't tell me that, it is a different era. No. The man was a racist. But he was a very talented racist, and so, we have museums to him. But somewhere in England, there's a statue right now that's kind of feeling a draft. David Copperfield is perhaps one of my favorite Dickens novels as well, just because it runs very true to Dickensian tropes. It's about the misery of life for those who do not have fame and fortune in England. Everybody is sort of precariously perched, be it about their finances or their morals. Women who exercise their sexual agency are always punished. Children have it really tough. There's a lot of child labor all the time in all his books, and he would know because he had to work because his father was put in debtor's prison. So a lot of the things that Dickens writes about, they're not really observations of English society. It's his lived experience. And so a lot of those elements have found their way into this book. That said, it is a hopeful story, it turns out well for people. The bad guy gets his just desserts. There's a romance and you kind of feel invested in it. And as far as the adaptation goes, I just imagine what his reaction might have been when he realized Dev Patel, an Indian, is playing basically a fictional version of himself in 2020. That's the kind of irony that just cracks me up. So if you've never read a Dickens novel in your life, I would say that you should start with David Copperfield because it really is a good and easy read as compared to some of his other work. There are a lot of elements in it that really introduce you to his writing style and the things that he thought were important. The social commentary aspect of it is very pertinent even today. And it gives you a really good idea of what life was like in Victorian England. There are other Dickens novels that are more famous or more adapted to screen, but I honestly do think that Copperfield is probably your best read out of all the Dickens novels. And I also recommend that you watch the adaptation by Armando Iannucci, just because it's funny and the performances are absolutely amazing, and I wasn't expecting it when I went into it. Like, I didn't know that this was what that movie is going to be like, which tells you that I'm stupid because obviously it's made by Armando Iannucci and it stars all these amazing people. It was bound to be good, but it has this energy to it that is very different from a lot of the other Dickens adaptations that I've seen, and I can't recommend it enough. Actually, if you don't want to read a book by a racist, that's fine, just watch the movie instead. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.